Both of my parents were Holocaust survivors from Krakow, Poland. Most of my adult life, when friends and colleagues became aware that my parents had survived the horrors of the Shoah, they would invariably ask, were they in the camps? I would respond that my father had been in several camps, and my mother survived in hiding. Again, invariably, most of these persons then asked about my father's experiences, but appeared to lose interest in my mother's. I also knew many details of my dad's experiences as he spoke about them often, but my mom never talked to my sister and me about hers. So I think that even I may have concluded that my dad's story was the most harrowing and traumatic. Of course, over time, I read countless books about the Holocaust and learned bits about my mother from my father, who knew her story. After my father's death, I began taking care of my mother, and through close contact, learned more about her as a person, not just a mom. And without minimizing in any way the horrifying and unimaginable hell suffered by persons incarcerated in concentration camps, I came to realize that Holocaust victims could also suffer terribly and be scarred for life without ever having been in a camp. My mother, Ruth Steiner, was born Ruth Meyer in March 1925 in Krakow. She lived a comfortable and happy life with her parents, David and Laura, and brother Zygmunt in the Jewish section of Krakow called Kazimierz. She skied in the Tatra Mountains in the winter and vacationed on the Black Sea in the summers. Her parents were not observant, and like most assimilated Jews in Krakow, she learned to speak perfect Polish. Nevertheless, she attended the Hebrew school for girls just across the street from her home, probably because of anti-Semitism in the public schools. She idolized her brother, only 2 years older, and they were very close. This happy, normal life ended abruptly when the Nazis invaded Poland in September 1939. My mother was only 14 years old. School stopped, wearing armbands became compulsory, and fear became the new normal. The Meyer family was uprooted in early 1941 when Jews in Krakow were forced to move to the newly established ghetto. Ruth and her brother asked their father why they couldn't simply leave Poland. Her father, who had fought along with the Germans in World War I, was convinced that nothing too bad could happen because, after all, the Germans were a civilized people. Years later, my mother recounted this to my sister and me with more than a touch of bitterness. My mother and her mother began to work for the Nazis, sewing dresses for the Nazi officers' wives. She recalled frequent trips with her mother to the famous castle in Krakow called the Wawel, where they measured and fit the wives of Nazi officers for their finery. During this period, the Germans required that all Jews register with the Nazi authorities. Later, they had to re-register to get the requisite work papers called Kennkarten. In the spring of 1942, all Krakow Jews had to re-register with the Germans yet again to get new work permits. She and her brother waited together on one of the many long lines until they decided to split up and wait on two different lines to see who would arrive first. My mother got the requisite permit, but her brother did not. In June 1942, her brother and thousands of other Jews were ordered to report for resettlement, and I quote, in the East. Just as an aside, coincidentally, Mordechai Gebirtig, whom many of you have heard me sing his songs, he was in that same group as my uncle. Of course, at that time, it was not well known where this group had been taken, but soon reports came in that they had been sent to Belzec, also known as Belzec, but it's Belzec in Polish, a death camp, and gassed in chambers flooded with carbon dioxide from diesel engines. My mother told us this story 50 years later when she was in her 70s, and my sister and I traveled to Krakow with our parents on their only trip back to Poland. On that trip, she revealed to us how she still felt guilty for having survived when her brother had not, and how she always wondered what would have happened had he only waited on the same line with her. My mother, generally a stoic who did not display much emotion, broke down crying when she told my sister and me about this, and then refused to continue to talk about her wartime experiences. At the time, it seemed to us that she feared that talking about her brother's fate would bring up memories she still could not bear to think about. I also believed she was very afraid of the deeply sad emotions she would feel if she confronted these memories by actually talking about them. After this deportation, the Germans contracted the size of the ghetto and rules for coming and going tightened. My mother and her mother were able to find work as seamstresses sewing Nazi uniforms in a factory located in the ghetto called Optima, owned by one of the so-called good Germans. During this period, my mother joined a small group of young Jews who gathered at her piano teacher's apartment to listen to records of classical music. One of the young men present was Edward Steiner, my father, who much later told me that he had been attracted to that pretty girl named Ruth, but that she didn't give him the time of day. In the fall of 1942, a second round of deportations began, and my grandmother was taken. At this point, most knew what resettlement really meant. I still shudder to imagine how my mother must have felt saying goodbye to her mother, both of them knowing what the ultimate destination was. Around the same time, my mother's father obtained false ID papers for both of them so that they could try to leave Krakow. They were just about ready to leave when someone denounced my grandfather, and he was arrested, presumably shot at the Płaszów camp, which you may remember from Schindler's List. The ID papers disappeared. My mother was 17 years old and totally on her own. She was resourceful enough to get new ID papers from the same man who had helped her father, and together with that man's mother, she got on a train and left Krakow for Warsaw, of all places. There, she, quote, hid in plain sight, passing as a Polish woman. She went to church every week, prayed with her rosaries, and knew the words to the Mass. I've read that only women with so-called good looks, quote unquote, were able to survive in hiding, and that the sad Jewish eyes of others were a dead giveaway that led to denunciations, arrest, and murder. A Krakow survivor, Miriam Peleg-Mariańska, who worked for the Polish Socialist Underground, wrote in her memoir that she was able to avoid wearing the armband and walk freely in Krakow because she had Aryan, quote, good looks. In the foreword to this memoir, Raphael Scharf, a Holocaust scholar originally from Krakow, noted that for a woman, and I quote, "The telltale details which could give one away were legion. The eyes could be cornflower blue, but their uncontrollable sadness was hard to disguise." Elie Wiesel, in a lecture at Boston University, stated, "I always write about eyes. During the war, the Jews were recognized by informers because of their eyes. Sad Jewish eyes. Deep suffering penetrates them." The photos I have of my mother from a few years after the war show a pretty young woman with dark hair, a nose with a bump, and to me, very sad Jewish eyes. Fortunately, she spoke impeccable Polish, managed to incorporate the habits of observant Catholics, and must have been incredibly brave and one heck of an actress. But I can't even begin to imagine what her day-to-day life was like. Peleg Mariańska described how Warsaw, far more than Krakow, was plagued by, quote, "informers and blackmailers and extortionists who preyed on people they recognized as Jews." She also said, again, quote, "Today, in retrospect, it seems incredible that we could lead an almost normal life, eat, sleep, wake, get dressed, take trouble with how we looked, all the while under the threat of a death sentence, and what was worse, that death, if something should go wrong, would not be the worst alternative." How did my mother survive 2.5 years living with constant fear like this? Several Holocaust scholars have noted that, quote, "passing was a form of hiding and was an active act of resistance." I do like to think of my mother hiding in plain sight was not only a way to survive, but also an act of resistance to an intolerable situation with no other options. Anyway, after the war, like so many Krakowian Jews, my mother returned to the city of her birth, only to find that she was the lone survivor of her immediate family. Just one uncle and his son managed to survive as well. One day, she bumped into my soon-to-be father on a main street. He had also returned to Krakow to determine whether any of his family had survived. My father said he looked like a skeleton at that time. He suddenly stopped in his tracks in front of my mother, remembering her from the ghetto music sessions. She remembered him as well and responded, "What's the matter? Are you seeing a ghost?" 6 months later, they were married. They wanted to go to the US, but immigration quotas for Poland were too small. Amazingly, my mother remembered that her mother's uncle lived in a town called San Francisco at an address on Sacramento Street. So she wrote to her great uncle asking if he could help. He had died earlier, but his wife, who was so astounded and moved that someone in the family had survived, responded. She was able to help my parents to go to Sweden in 1946 by posting a bond with the Swedish government, securing my parents' promise that they would live there only temporarily, not obtain a Swedish passport, and would go to the US as soon as the Polish quotas opened up. My parents moved to Stockholm shortly after they married, and I was born there. We finally traveled to New York in 1951. My mother rarely talked with us about her wartime experiences, except for that bit during our trip to Krakow together in 1999. When my younger daughter, Hillary, was working on a project regarding the Holocaust her junior year, she asked her grandmother if she would tell her about her experiences. But my mother refused to talk to her, much to Hillary's dismay. My sister and I respected her silence, and after that breakdown from guilt over her brother's fate, we did not ask too much or too often, fearing to increase her anguish and her pain. Now, having realized how very many unanswered questions I have, I wonder whether we should have pushed a little more. My mother died last year at age 96 after a long battle with dementia. Wherever she might be now, I like to imagine she has been reunited with my father, of course, but also with her brother at last.